November 12, 1959/4:17 p.m. /Lenox Avenue, Harlem, New York. The weight of Harlem rested on Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's shoulders, a familiar mantle woven from number slips, jazz notes, and the quiet fear of men who knew better than to cross him. It was a weight he carried with the grace of a king surveying his domain from the plush leather of his chauffeured Cadillac. The late autumn light, thick and golden as bourbon, slanted across the avenue, catching the chrome of the automobile and glinting in his weary eyes. He was power incarnate, a man whose whispered command could flood a street with soldiers or silence it like a tomb. Yet, in that moment, as his driver, Junie Bird, navigated the bustling thoroughfare, Bumpy was just an uncle, waiting on his niece. Sarah was 17, the daughter of his sister, and she was the one pure, untainted thing in his carefully curated world of shadows. She was supposed to meet him at the Red Rooster after her volunteer shift at the Harlem Hospital Library. She was never late. Never. Sarah was precision, a clockwork of responsibility and bright, bubbling life that stood in stark contrast to the calculated chaos of his own existence. 4:17 p.m. 17 minutes past their meeting time. A knot, small and cold, began to form in the pit of his stomach. He tapped his manicured fingers on the polished wood of the door panel, a rhythmic beat of controlled impatience. "She's probably just chatting with one of her friends, Bump," Junie said, his eyes on the rearview mirror, reading his boss's subtle tells. Junie had been with him for 15 years. He knew the difference between Bumpy's business anger and the rarer, more terrifying animal of his personal fear. "Sarah don't chat when she's due," Bumpy stated, his voice a low rumble. It wasn't a guess, it was a fact. He had instilled in her the importance of her word, of time, of duty. It was the only armor he could give her against a world he knew to be predatory and unforgiving. He had Junie circle the block. Then again, the knot in his gut tightened, pulling at the threads of his composure. The king was feeling the first tremors of a peasant's panic. He had men who could find a whisper in a hurricane, who could track a debtor through the 7 circles of hell, but the simple, maddening silence of his niece's absence was a fortress he couldn't breach. He thought of her smile, the way she would mock his expensive suits, her fierce intelligence that he prayed would carry her far away from this life he'd built. She was his legacy, not the buildings he owned or the politicians in his pocket. She was the redemption he didn't believe he deserved but craved all the same. November 12, 1959/5:32 p.m. /Harlem Hospital. He walked into the hospital not as a kingpin but as a worried relative, a disguise that felt ill-fitting and thin. The antiseptic smell of the place was an assault, a sterile promise of healing that felt like a lie. The nurses at the front desk knew who he was. You didn't operate in Harlem without knowing Bumpy Johnson's face. But his usual aura of command was gone, replaced by a raw, pleading urgency. "My niece, Sarah Johnson. She volunteers in the library. Was she here today?" The head nurse, a stern woman named Mrs. Gable whose face was a roadmap of long shifts and little patience, checked her logbook. "She signed out at 3:30, Mr. Johnson. On the dot, like always. 3:30. 2 hours ago. The walk from the hospital to the Rooster was 15 minutes, 20 if she stopped to look in a shop window." The knot in his stomach became a cold, coiling serpent. He thanked the nurse, his voice strained, and walked back out into the encroaching twilight. The vibrant energy of Harlem, the sounds of laughter and traffic and music spilling from open doorways, suddenly seemed menacing. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every passing car a potential cage. His empire, his kingdom, the streets he owned and bled for, had swallowed his niece whole. The feeling of absolute powerlessness was a poison he had never tasted before. It was acrid and terrifying, burning away the facade of the untouchable man, leaving only a terrified uncle standing on a darkening street corner. November 12, 1959/7:01 p.m. Bumpy Johnson's residence, Astor Row. The brownstone on Astor Row was a fortress of quiet elegance, a testament to the prophets of vice. Inside, the silence was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Bumpy stood in the center of his study, surrounded by leather-bound books he'd read and chess sets he'd mastered. These were the trappings of a thoughtful man, a strategist. But strategy required information, and he had none. His sister, Sarah's mother, had been calling every 10 minutes, her voice a thin wire of rising hysteria. He had lied to her, told her Sarah was probably at a movie with friends, that teenagers were flighty. The lie tasted like ash in his mouth. He picked up the phone and made the first call, then the second, then the 10th. He spoke in clipped, cold tones, the king reasserting his throne. "I want every ear you got to the ground," he told one lieutenant. "Shake every tree. I don't care what falls out," to another. "Turn this burrow upside down. I want her found." Junie Bird stood by the door, a silent sentinel, watching the carefully constructed edifice of his boss crumble from the inside out. He would later speak of this moment, his words recorded by a hopeful biographer decades later, a testament to the legend. Witness testimony, Junie Bird. "I seen Bump face down shotguns. I seen him stare into the eyes of men he was about to send to their maker, and he never flinched. Not once. He was carved from granite, you understand? But that night, the granite cracked. He was on the phone, barking orders, being the boss. But when he hung up that last call, he just stood there in the middle of that big, fancy room. The light from the desk lamp cut across his face, and I saw his shoulders, they just sagged. Like the strings holding him up got cut. He walked over to the window, looking out at the street he owned, and he put his hand against the glass. His whole body started to shake, just a little at first, then more. It wasn't a loud thing. It was quiet. A quiet, terrible shaking. I never heard him cry, not with sound. But that night I saw it. The man who was a god on the streets of Harlem was just a man, a scared man. And I knew, right then, that whoever had done this, whoever took that girl, they hadn't just signed their own death warrant. They had declared war on a force of nature they couldn't possibly understand. The shaking stopped as quickly as it began. Bumpy turned from the window, his face a mask of cold fury, the fear transmuted into something harder, something lethal. The desperate uncle was gone. In his place stood the godfather of Harlem, and he was about to unleash a storm. He looked at Junie, his eyes burning with a righteous fire. "Get the car," he commanded, his voice raspy. "And get the doctor. Tell him to be ready. We're going to war." The clock had started. The search was no longer a search. It was a hunt. November 12th, 1959/9:43 p.m. The Cotton Club. The new Cotton Club wasn't the old one, but it was Bumpy's. It was his court, his throne room. Tonight, it was his war room. The music was silenced, the patrons sent home. Under the dim lights, surrounded by ghosts of jazz legends, Bumpy's capos and lieutenants stood assembled. Men who ran numbers, men who ran protection, men who ran the docks. Killers, thieves, and businessmen, all silent, all waiting. On a large table, Bumpy and Junie unrolled a map of Harlem. It was grid, marked with their territories, their collection spots, their safe houses. A kingdom on paper. She was taken between 3:30 and 4 o'clock. Bumpy began, his voice devoid of emotion, a tool of pure tactical precision. "Somewhere between Harlem Hospital and the Red Rooster. That's a 10-block radius." He circled the area on the map with a red pen. "This is where we start. I want every tenement, every flop house, every back room, every basement in this circle turned inside out. Every single one. No exceptions." He pointed to a man named Detroit Red, a lean, hungry-looking enforcer. "Red, you take the east side of Lenox. Use your people. Be quiet. Be invisible, but miss nothing." He pointed to another, Frankie, the suit, Costello, no relation to the other one. "Frankie, you take the west. You got the connections with the Italian boys downtown. See if anyone's heard anything. Any new players in town, anyone moving product they shouldn't be." He went on like this for 20 minutes, deploying his forces with the cold calculus of a general. An army of the underworld, mobilized not for profit or for territory, but for one missing girl. He was using the very machinery of his criminal empire to find the victim of a crime his world enabled. The irony was a bitter pill, but he swallowed it without flinching. There was no time for philosophy. "One more thing," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that carried more menace than a shout. "This ain't about money. This ain't about territory. This is blood. My blood. When you find the people responsible, don't call me. Don't wait for my word. End them. Burn the ground they stand on. I want a message sent so loud that God himself hears it in heaven. You do not touch my family." A murmur of assent rippled through the room. They were his men, and this was a sacred vow. The meeting broke, the men melting back into the Harlem night, ghosts on a mission. Bumpy remained at the map, staring at the red circle, a wound on the paper heart of his kingdom. November 13th, 1959/12:14 a.m. / a cigar bar on 125th Street. The hours bled into one another. The city's pulse throbbed around them, oblivious. For Bumpy, the world had shrunk to the crackle of the Cadillac's two-way radio and the acrid taste of stale coffee. Every report was a dead end. A tenement cleared, a known pimp questioned, and left bleeding in an alley, his information useless. A drug den raided, its inhabitants too lost in their own haze to see yesterday, let alone a missing girl. The net was vast, but the fish was elusive. Then, a crackle of hope. A call came in from an informant, a small-time hustler named Weasel who owed Bumpy his life. "Got something, Bump," Weasel's reedy voice squawked over the radio. "A girl, matches the description. Saw some of the new jacks, the ones from out of town, pull her into a building over on St. Nicholas, near 148th. A flop house. They were rough with her. The address was outside the initial search radius, a grim expansion of the possibilities." Junie slammed the Cadillac into gear before Bumpy even gave the order, the tires screaming in protest. For the first time in hours, a flicker of something other than cold rage sparked in Bumpy's chest. Hope. It was a fragile, dangerous thing. They raced through the sleeping streets, the city lights a blur. The building was a derelict brownstone, its windows boarded up like blind eyes. Bumpy's men were already there, materializing from the shadows, guns drawn. They moved with silent, practiced efficiency. Bumpy and Junie went in first. The stench of urine, rot, and despair hit them like a physical blow. They kicked in a door on the second floor. And there she was. A girl, 17, maybe 18, with Sarah's hair, Sarah's build. She was huddled in a corner, her clothes torn, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it had swallowed her voice. But it wasn't her. The face was wrong. The eyes, though terrified, were not Sarah's eyes. The wave of relief that it wasn't his niece was immediately crushed by the undertow of despair that it wasn't his niece. The false alarm was a physical gut punch, stealing the air from his lungs. He looked at this stranger, this other man's daughter, and saw the face of his own failure. He had torn his city apart looking for his girl, while this one suffered in silence. He turned to his men. "Get her out of here. Take her to the clinic. Clean her up. Give her $1,000. And put her on a bus to anywhere she wants to go." He looked at the two low-level thugs who had been guarding her, their faces a mixture of fear and bravado. Bumpy didn't even look at Junie. He didn't need to. "Deal with them," he said, his voice flat and dead. He walked out of the building, not waiting to hear the muffled sounds that followed. The hope had been a cruel trick, a false dawn. The night was blacker than ever, and the clock was still ticking. The serpent in his gut coiled tighter, its fangs dripping ice into his veins. He had never felt so close to breaking. The hunt was back on, but now it was fueled by a desperation that bordered on madness. He had just seen what they did to other people's daughters. The image of what they might be doing to his was a fire threatening to consume him whole. November 13th, 1959/3:28 a.m. / an alleyway off Adam Clayton Powell Jr. Boulevard. The city was a labyrinth, and he was lost in it. Every lead evaporated. Every whisper led to a wall of silence. The systematic takedown of his own underworld was yielding nothing. Bumpy sat in the back of the Cadillac, the map spread on his lap, now covered in crossed-out streets and dead-end notes. He was a king with no country, a general with a phantom enemy. The fury had burned down to a low, cold ember of dread. He was beginning to think the unthinkable. It was a junkie, a ghost haunting the edges of his empire, who finally gave them the key. One of Frankie's boys had found him shivering in an alley, chasing a high. He'd been babbling about a new kind of party, an exclusive thing for high rollers from downtown. Not in Harlem, but on the edge of it, in a place no one would look. A condemned industrial laundry near the river on the far west side. A place officially off the map, owned by a shell corporation with ties to a new, vicious syndicate trying to muscle in on the city's trade in flesh. They specialized in clean girls, innocents, to satisfy a depraved clientele. They were using a new, potent brand of heroin to make them compliant. The junkie described a girl who had been brought in late the previous afternoon. A fighter, he'd said. Pretty. Smart-looking. He'd overheard the guards complaining about her. Her name, he thought, was Sarah. The ember of dread in Bumpy's chest exploded into a supernova of white-hot rage. This was it. This was the place. The systemic evil now had a location. He looked at Junie, and no words were necessary. The hunt was over. The war was about to begin. November 13th, 1959/4:11 a.m. Abandoned Perfection Laundry, West Harlem Piers. The building was a concrete tomb silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky, the Hudson River a sheet of black glass beside it. It radiated a profound sickness, a corruption that seeped into the very air. Junie parked the Cadillac a block away. Within minutes, 30 of Bumpy's best men had converged, moving like wraiths through the industrial wasteland. They carried shotguns, Tommy guns, and a cold, righteous certainty. This wasn't about territory anymore. This was an extermination. Bumpy stood before them, a general addressing his troops before the final charge. His face, illuminated by the faint glow of a distant street lamp, was a death mask. There are 2 rules, he said, his voice a low, gravelly promise of violence. 1, my niece comes out alive. Anyone who gets in the way of that dies. 2, no one else comes out alive. No witnesses. No survivors. We are erasing this place, and the scum inside it, from the face of the earth. This is not for me. This is for a child of Harlem they thought they could steal. Show them how wrong they were. He didn't wait for a reply. He nodded to Junie, and the raid began. They didn't knock. 2 men used a battering ram on the steel side door, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the unnatural quiet. The assault was instant and overwhelming. Gunfire erupted, a cacophony of brutal, close-quarters combat. Bumpy's men flowed into the building like a tide of vengeance. Bumpy and Junie moved past the initial firefight, heading deeper inside, following a map scrawled on a napkin by the junkie informant. The place was a maze of rusting machinery and filthy corridors. The air was thick with the smell of mold, chemicals, and human misery. They passed rooms where other girls, gaunt and hollow-eyed, were chained to beds. Bumpy's men would deal with them later. The mission had one target. They found the room at the back of the basement. The door was reinforced steel. 2 of his men set a small charge. The explosion was deafening. Bumpy was the first one through the smoke. And he saw her. Sarah was on a soiled mattress in the corner of a damp, windowless cell. She was pale, her skin clammy, her eyes unfocused and dilated. A needle mark, stark and bruised, was visible on the inside of her arm. She was alive, but only just. The bright light of her spirit had been dimmed to a flickering ember. For a single, eternal second, Bumpy Johnson's heart stopped. The king, the killer, the strategist. All of it dissolved into the primal agony of a man seeing the person he loved most in the world broken. He rushed to her side, gathering her into his arms. She was terrifyingly light. She flinched at his touch, a low whimper escaping her lips. "Uncle Bumpy," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp, a ghost of itself. The sound of his name from her lips was both a relief and a dagger to the heart. "I'm here, baby," he choked out, pulling her tight, trying to pour his own strength into her. "I'm here. I got you." Junie stood guard at the door, his shotgun leveled, his face grim. The sounds of the cleansing continued upstairs, a righteous symphony of destruction. Dr. Miller, the physician Bumpy had on retainer, rushed in with a medical bag, his face a mask of professional concern. He took one look at Sarah, at her pupils, at the track mark, and went to work, administering a shot to counteract the overdose that was slowly killing her. Bumpy held his niece, rocking her gently, whispering promises he wasn't sure he could keep. He was looking at the direct consequence of the world he inhabited. The heroin that flowed through the city, the corruption that allowed a place like this to exist, the violence that was his stock in trade. It had all converged on this one innocent soul. He had built an empire on the sins of men, and the bill had just come due, paid by the person he loved most. As he carried her out of that concrete hell, past the bodies of her captors, he knew this was a debt that could never be fully repaid. He had won the battle, but the war against the darkness, both outside and within himself, was far from over. The 18-hour raid was complete. The lifetime of atonement had just begun. November 13th, 1959/7:30 a.m. / a private clinic, Upper East Side. The dawn broke gray and cold over Manhattan, but inside the sterile white room of the private clinic, time had no meaning. There was only the shallow, ragged rhythm of Sarah's breathing. Bumpy had not left her side. He sat in a chair by the bed, his expensive suit rumpled and stained, his face a roadmap of exhaustion and grief. He had paid Dr. Miller a small fortune for his silence and his services, setting him up in this discreet location far from the eyes and ears of Harlem. The doctor's prognosis was grim. She'll live, Bumpy. She's strong. But they flooded her system with a high-grade heroin. To keep her docile, the physical dependency will have set in fast. When she wakes up, the withdrawal is going to begin. It's going to be ugly. There's nothing to be done but to see her through it. Ugly was an understatement. The first day was a descent into a private hell. Sarah thrashed against the restraints they had to use to keep her from harming herself, her body racked with violent tremors and muscle spasms. She screamed, not in words, but in raw, animal sounds of pure agony. Cold sweats drenched the sheets, followed by feverish chills that made her teeth chatter uncontrollably. Bumpy sat and watched, a helpless titan. Every scream was a nail driven into his soul. This was his fault. He had allowed the poison to fester in his city, believing he could control it, believing he could keep his own world separate and clean. He had been a fool. The money, the power, the fear he inspired. It was all meaningless in the face of this raw, physical suffering. He tried to speak to her during her brief moments of lucidity, his voice a low, soothing rumble. "It's okay, Sarah girl. I'm right here. You just have to fight." Sometimes, her eyes would focus on him, and in them, he saw not recognition, but a terrifying, bottomless fear. She was trapped in a nightmare, and he was a part of its landscape. Witness testimony, Junie Bird. I'd bring him coffee, food. He wouldn't touch none of it. Just sat there, watching her. For 3 days. I never seen a man look so hollowed out. It was like her pain was scooping out his insides. On the second day, she was screaming something awful, calling for her mama, calling for God. Bumpy, he just puts his head in his hands and starts to whisper. I had to lean in to hear him. He was praying. Bumpy Johnson, the man who folks said had lunch with the devil, was praying to God. He wasn't asking for forgiveness for himself. He was just begging God to take her pain and put it on him instead. He said, take it from her. She's innocent. Give it to me. I've earned it. That's when I understood. It wasn't just about saving her no more. It was about him trying to find some peace of his own soul again. November 15th, 1959/11 p.m. / the private clinic. On the third night, the storm broke. The tremors subsided. The fever cooled. Sarah fell into a deep, natural sleep, the first she'd had in days. The physical battle was over. The deeper war for her mind was just beginning. Bumpy knew she couldn't go back to Harlem. The memories, the whispers, the very streets would be a constant reminder of her trauma. He spent the rest of the night on the phone, calling in favors from men in positions of power far beyond the 5 boroughs. By sunrise, he had arranged it. A private, long-term care facility in the quiet green hills of Vermont, a place specializing in trauma and addiction, run by a renowned psychiatrist. A place where she could heal, where she could become whole again, far from the shadows of his world. It would cost him a fortune, nearly a quarter of his liquid assets. He paid it without a second thought. It was a piss-poor attempt at penance, but it was all he could offer. December 2nd, 1959 / a federal courthouse, Foley Square. The raid on the Perfection Laundry was too loud, too bloody to be ignored. 17 bodies, all members of the upstart syndicate, were found. The papers called it the St. Valentine's Day Massacre of Harlem. The feds, who had been trying to pin something on Bumpy for years, saw their chance. They knew he was behind it, but they couldn't prove it. The problem was, the heat was now on his entire organization and, by extension, on his family. Federal agents were crawling all over Harlem, sniffing around his businesses, leaning on his people. The scrutiny was a threat to the fragile peace Sarah needed to heal. So Bumpy made a choice. He orchestrated a deal. He would take a fall on a lesser, but still serious, charge, A narcotics conspiracy charge from years ago they could suddenly make stick with a new, well-paid witness. It would be a long sentence, 10 years, minimum, but it would satisfy the feds. It would get them to back off. It would buy his family peace. He stood before the judge, his face impassive, and accepted his sentence. As they led him away in handcuffs, he caught Junie's eye in the back of the courtroom. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Take care of them. Junie nodded back. To the end of the line, bump. January 20th, 1961/USP Alcatraz, San Francisco Bay. The Rock was a world away from Harlem. A cold, damp, concrete purgatory surrounded by freezing water and fog. Bumpy Johnson, AZ, 1441, was no longer a king. He was a number. But even here, his reputation preceded him. The other inmates, the hardest men in the federal system, gave him a wide berth. They called him the professor because he spent his days in the library, reading philosophy, history, poetry. He was playing a long game. The game of survival. The game of waiting. His only connection to the outside world was the mail. Once a month, a letter would arrive from Vermont. At first, they were written in a shaky, uncertain hand. Sarah wrote of the quiet, the snow, the therapy sessions. She wrote of nightmares and fear. Bumpy would write back, long letters filled with encouragement, with stories of his own childhood, with chess strategies that were really lessons about life. Control the center of the board, Sarah girl. Control your own mind, and no one can ever truly own you. As the years passed, her letters grew stronger. The handwriting became firm and confident. She wrote about finishing her high school diploma, about taking college courses in literature. She sent him a photograph in 1964. She was standing by a lake, a small, genuine smile on her face. The haunted look in her eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet resilience. Bumpy kept that photo in his copy of Dante's Inferno. He would look at it every night before turning out the lights, a reminder of the circle of hell he had walked through and the paradise he had fought to preserve for her. He wrote about his life on the Rock, sanitizing the grim reality. He never mentioned the violence, the despair. He wrote about the sea birds and the view of the city lights across the bay, painting a picture of monastic contemplation. He was serving his penance, and his letters were his confession, his act of contrition. Through their correspondence, across a distance of 3,000 miles and a wall of steel and stone, an uncle and his niece rebuilt their family, one stamp at a time. He was watching her grow up on paper, and she was keeping the best part of him alive. November 5th, 1968, a small cafe, Greenwich Village, New York. The world had changed in the near decade he'd been away. The country was a different place, raw and fractured by war and protest. Harlem was different, too. Bumpy, released early for good behavior, was now in his 60s. The fire in his belly had been banked, replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. He was a relic, a ghost from another era. His empire had been carved up, his power faded. He didn't care. He had only one piece of unfinished business. He sat at a small table in a quiet cafe, his hands, older now, the knuckles swollen with arthritis, wrapped around a cup of black coffee. He was more nervous than he had been on the day of his sentencing. Junie Bird, grayer and heavier but still loyal, stood by the door, giving him his space. Then she walked in. Sarah was 26 years old. She was a woman. She wore a simple dress and carried herself with a poise and confidence that took his breath away. The scars weren't visible, but he knew they were there. Yet, she hadn't been defined by them. She had overcome them. She was a survivor, a testament to a strength he hadn't known she possessed. She saw him and hesitated for a moment, a stranger with a familiar face. He stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. The years melted away. He wasn't an aging ex-con, and she wasn't a damaged victim. They were just family, finally in the same room again. She walked to the table, and he saw a flicker of the 17-year-old girl in her eyes. He didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry" was too small a phrase for the continent of his guilt. "I love you" felt unearned. She saved him. A slow smile spread across her face, the same bright, genuine smile from the photograph. She reached out, not for a handshake, but for an embrace. He held her, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the impossible, miraculous fact of her presence. She was whole. She was safe. She was free. She pulled back, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She looked at the man who had torn his world apart and sacrificed a decade of his life for her. She saw the cost in the lines on his face, in the weariness of his posture. He had built a kingdom of sin, but his final, defining act had been one of grace. "It's good to see you, Pop," she said, her voice clear and strong. Pop, not Uncle Bumpy, not the name the streets knew, the name that carried the weight of fear and legend. A new name, a name of forgiveness, of family, of love, a name that signified a legacy. Bumpy Johnson's shoulders, which had carried the weight of a kingdom and the burden of a terrible guilt, finally felt light. The raid, the prison sentence, the long, silent years, it had all been worth it. His greatest hustle, his most profound legacy, wasn't the empire he had built, but the single, precious life he had saved. In the quiet of a Greenwich Village cafe, the godfather of Harlem finally found his redemption.